Now let's look at the weaknesses of the United Nations. Yeah, much as we see the United Nations registering a number of successes, but it has got also some of the weaknesses. Mind you, the United Nations is an organization that is there. It is an ongoing organization. Now, let's look at some of the things that this organization, the United Nations, has not done well. So some of them, number one, is like lack of cooperation and absence of some permanent members. Yeah, so lack of cooperation. There is no cooperation. That's real cooperation in this United Nations. For example, when the United Nations General Assembly condemned Russia for her aggression in Hungary, that is in 1956, we have just looked at this one, and in Czechoslovakia in 1968, Russia just ignored on those things. So that one, it shows lack of cooperation, especially in those bigger states. They are not cooperating to what the Assembly or the General Assembly of the United Nations is advocating. And also China stayed out of the United Nations until 1971. So remember, China was one of the permanent members of the United Nations. And look at it, that the permanent member then staying out of that big organization which she started. So that one again is a weakness. And also another example is the or maybe just to sum up or to add on what happened with China, was that during that period the Chinese seat in the General Assembly or in the Council, remember that China is one of the permanent members of the Security Council, so that one was occupied by Taiwan. So Taiwan was sitting in place of China. Another weakness, apart from lack of cooperation, is during the Cold War. The Cold War, remember, we have just looked at the Cold War. So it said that during the Cold War, the United Nations organization had been unsuccessful in dealing with issues. So where especially the interest of the great powers were coinciding or coincided. So we are saying that when the bigger powers had an interest in a certain aspect, then that one, it was ignored. The United Nations was unable to act swiftly accordingly. So to that, we see to it that it was unable to deal successfully with the issues where the big powers were concerned. Another weakness, the United Nations organization usually fails. It fails to deal with disputes at an early stage. So which allows the problems to become complicated. For example, it took too long for the United Nations to intervene in Syrian crisis in 2012. As of now, Syria is in shambles. Syria, there is instability. To a larger extent, the blame goes to the United Nations. Why? It took too long to intervene on issues in Syria. So it's just the same, just as it is with the minor issues. We can take, for example, Malawi and Tanzania. They are scrambling, they are quarreling they are disputing over the lake, that is ownership of Lake Malawi. To the other side, they call it Lake Nyasa. Here we call it Lake Malawi, things like those. So such disputes, the United Nations has not yet made its stand or intervened in this issue. But it doesn't mean that that issue is over. To the Tanzanians, it's still there. To us, it's still there. But then the United Nations is just looking at such issues up to the extent maybe in generations to come you find that a war will break out on issues that could have been solved smoothly or at the earliest stage. So that is the weakness. Another one is the use of veto. The use of veto by the permanent members was always has always paralyzed the political activities of the UNO. So the veto, the right to veto, the right to object, that one gives the permanent members a power, a very special power to block any proposal that is not in their interest. So we see to it that with this right to veto of all those permanent members, that one, it gives them a special power, a special strength, so that they, in the end, they block any proposal that is not in their interest. Another weakness of the United Nations is that some member states depend more on their regional bodies in settling disputes than on the UNO, the United Nations. Right, so for example, such groupings or examples of such groupings which some of these countries they rely much for example the NATO, we looked at the NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the SEATO, the African Union. So all these things, some other states, they rely much on these ones than the United Nations. But remember, we said that the United Nations is the biggest organization in the world. But then some other states, they prefer to present their issues in the regional organizations. For example, I was just giving the example of the Lake Malawi issue. That one has been taken up by the SADC. Now the SADC is the one that is looking after our issue. So look at that. The United Nations has not intervened, but it is only the regional organization that is in there. But if West comes to West, that's when you see the United Nations coming in with their decisions there. And also, most member states, they prefer to vote by their blocks rather than on merit. Now here we're saying that the motion to condemn terrorism, for example, was defeated by the Arab states and their supporters. So that's where you can understand better by when we say that they prefer to vote by their blocks, to say, all right, these are the countries from the sub-Saharan. There's an issue here, maybe to be condemned by the United Nations. Then you find that all the countries from the sub-Saharan, they block that issue. So that's what we are saying here, that they prefer to vote by their block. So a good example here is the motion which was there in the United Nations to defeat or to condemn terrorism. But that one, it was defeated by the Arab states, because all the Arab states, they belong to one bloc. So here another one was that, or another weakness is that the United Nations has had constant problems of funding. So funding becomes a problem, or it is a continued problem of the United Nations. So some members some members, they refuse to contribute financially, either because of their problems or as a sign of disapproving some of the issues or destructive policies or the policies that do not favor them. So as such, they fail to contribute maybe the membership fee that they are supposed to pay. Now let's look at the case studies of the failures. We have just looked at the failures. We have outlined some of the failures of the United Nations. But what are some of the case studies? So that's what we are to look at now. So the first one is the Hungarian. This one, the Hungarian Crisis. Now, or rising in 1956. So Hungarian, or the Hungarians, or Hungary, wanted independence from Russia. Remember, we talked about it to say the 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 communists, they put their government in Hungary, and there was that president Imre. That president, he just came in and wanted to change the things. So that is the thing that we're talking about here. So Russian troops, they moved in and crushed the revolt in November 1956. So that's what happened. So thousands of people there were killed, both the Russians and the Hungarians. But then Russia, the Russian veto stopped the council from acting, because it was to decide, it was in the interest of Russia. Therefore, Russia vetoed as a member of the Security Council. So the General Assembly later condemned the invasion of Russia, although Russia was the member of the Security Council, but the General Assembly managed to condemn Russia, to say what you are doing there is not good, it's uncalled for. So Russia under Nikita Khrushchev. So Nikita Khrushchev, at one point in time, he became the leader of Russia. So he was Nikita Khrushchev. So this one, simply ignored it. They ignored that condemnation by the League of Nations. So the Western powers were preoccupied with the Suez Canal events, and they could not intervene in that issue. We talked about it. We talked about this one during maybe the Cold War, on the Cold War. It's a thing that to also look at on the Cold War, yes. The second example or case study of the failure of the United Nations is the Arab-Israel conflict, and this one was started in 1948. Now, what happened here was that the United Nations portioned Palestine in 1948, and they formed the state of Israel. So Israel, you have to know that it was created in 1948. That's when the nation currently known as Israel was created, as known as it is now. So the Arabs were not happy with that, because it was taken from Palestine and created. So the Arabs were not happy that large part of Palestine went to the Israelis, or to Israel. Then the Arab troops attacked Israel. So they attacked Israel. The UNO has been was unable, or it has been unable, because that Arab and Israel conflict is still there up now. So the UNO has been able to arrange the ceasefire, but has failed to secure the lasting solution. That's why up to now you hear that the Palestinians and the Israelis, they are constantly throwing missiles to each other up to this day. So having looked at the Arab-Israel failure, let's look at also the Czechoslovakia. another failure, registered failure of the United Nations in 1968. So President Svoboda introduced a new reform program in Czechoslovakia. So Russia, as you know, Russia also controlled or put the communist government in Czechoslovakia. So Russia felt she was losing control of the country and she invaded Czechoslovakia on 20th August 1969. So the Security Council of the United Nations condemned this act, condemned this action, but the Soviets, that is Russia itself, vetoed. So Russia vetoed this this condemnation. So it happened like that. So the UNO, on the other hand, did nothing with Russia. So it was another registered failure of the United Nations in 1968 when she failed, or when this organization failed to control Russia over Czechoslovakia. Another failure of the League of Nations, the Rhodesia Crisis of 1965. Now, after failing to obtain independence from Britain, that is Southern Rhodesia, which was under Ian Smith. So this leader, he campaigned for a universal declaration of independence, UDI, Universal Declaration of Independence, because they failed to do it in a good way. So in 1968, the United Nations imposed some economic sanctions on Southern Rhodesia, that is on Zimbabwe. So there were economic sanctions on trade, especially on trade. No country should trade with Zimbabwe for what it did, for this, what she did to declare a universal independence of Zimbabwe. That's what happened. Then the sanctions were on Zimbabwe in the same year. But some countries did not cooperate. So other countries, they looked at that to say, no, our Zimbabwe is our trade partner, so why should we not trade with her? So they did not cooperate, and the UNO failed to stop them. It failed to stop them from trading with Rhodesia or Zimbabwe. So it was a failure, because the United Nations put the sanctions, but those sanctions were not abided to by the members, because they were not supposed to trade with Zimbabwe, and others, they continued to trade with Zimbabwe. As a result, it was a registered failure of the League or United Nations. Now, we have come to the end, or we are towards the end of this part. We are looking at the United Nations. But to a larger extent, we have seen that this United Nations, the UNO, United Nations, it was more similar to the League of Nations. It was more similar. Therefore, let's compare. Let's look at the comparison. Let's compare the two, the United Nations and the League of Nations. So to begin with, the UNO, or the United Nations, has an army, while the League of Nations did not have. So you can compare that one. And the UNO has wider scope of activities than the League of Nations. Remember, we looked at the Socio-Economic Council. That one, that is the overseer of many of the agents of the League or United Nations, the UNESCO, the World Bank, IMF, ILO, and many others. So it has a wide variety of activities. And the General Assembly of the League of Nations, of the League, of the United Nations organization, that one, it has got more power than the League of Nations. So they have what we call the uniting for peace resolution. This one you should remember, because we said it was established in 1950, whereby the assembly has got the power to run over uh, a veto by a big power. So whenever there is a veto, then they are able to overrun that veto. If that one, the solution is to unite for peace, they carry on with that decision. So it has got more power than the League of Nations. The right to veto exists both in the League of Nations and the United Nations. So in the League of Nations, all had the right to vote, but in the UNO, only 5 permanent. So here it's to veto, yeah. All have the right to veto, and however, in the United Nations organizations, only 5 permanent members, those ones, they are the ones who have got the right to object a decision. So these are the members of the Security Council. You have to remember that. So the United Nations has attempted to limit impartiality in its work. How has it done that? Through the appointment or selection of the Secretary General. So the Secretary Generals are drawn from smaller and non-influential nations. So judges of the International Court of Justice are selected from different countries as well. So with that, we see it has made some limits to impartiality, to avoid those impartiality. The UNO has almost achieved the concept of universal organization. See, the United Nations, it has achieved at least to have many members. It has got almost 192 members or member states, while the League, they did not exceed 50 countries in the League of Nations. I don't know if Malawi was a member of the League of Nations. I can't remember that. Yeah, but the United Nations has got 192. The UNO demonstrated its will to safeguard individual human rights, and it did this on 10th December 1948, whereby they adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So human rights, if you hear human rights organization, human rights defenders, what, all those things, they got their power from the United Nations, which was established in 1948. So the UNO, the United Nations, has been more successful in its peacekeeping operations than the League of Nations. In peacekeeping, you remember when we are mentioning of the League of Nations, it failed in peacekeeping missions, but the United Nations, it has registered some successes in Kosovo and many other areas. Although in DRC it is becoming more ways. The more the United Nations is intervening there, the more the things get worse. The aims of both the organizations are similar. That is, the aim of the United Nations as well as the League of Nations were to maintain peace and promote cooperation in socio-economic problems and the socio-economic problems. So to this far, we have reached the end. We have reached the end of this topic. That is, we are looking at the formation of the League or United Nations. So we have looked at a number of issues on the stages, how it was formed, its organization, and we have looked at what were some of the successes of this United Nations and some of the failures and their case studies. And finally, we have concluded this topic by comparing the League of Nations, which was there soon after the end of the First World War, and the United Nations, which was created or took the place of the League of Nations and was created soon after the end of the Second World War. So we have looked at the comparisons there. So we have looked at it, say more of the activities were the same, only that the United Nations has taken those activities to a wider scope, to a wider range. So it has been a wonderful topic indeed. But next time we'll be also looking at another topic, and this topic will be very, very fascinating, and it is a very interesting topic in this world history. So this one is the post-war alliances. That is, after the war, after the Second World War, there were alliances that were formed. What were these alliances? And what were the aims of these alliances? So you need to be very attentive on when we come to this one, because most of these alliances, they shaped the route to the modern world, to the modern times that we are living. So let's be together in that topic as well, as we'll be looking at the post-war alliances. Have a good time.
Simutaya nthawi yanu kufunafuna maphunziro muzakhala wotumidwa moyo wanu wonse. Ngati simuphunzira anthu azingokutumani ajala kalime, ajala kuchwe manyazi, ajala katende yanti, ndipo anthu ophunzira wandi wotumanso kwambiri. Ndiye ngati simuphunzira skulu akuyikirani apa mukhala otumidwa.